listening to Emerald, America's premier propaganda network.
You are listening to Emerald, America's premier propaganda network. I'm your host, Enoch Emmanuel, and today we're talking about the importance of doing psychedelic drugs, catalyzing transformative experiences, and opening the doors of true perception. Now, this is such an important topic. I think everyone among us today knows the importance of these substances and the reality of the world that they allow us to see. A lot of people don't know exactly how it works, but just opening up this topic, we want to talk about just how, mind-boggling it is that today, you can become, the president or a senator. You're allowed to lead this country. You're allowed to have positions of power, even if you've never done acid in your entire life or smoked DMT even once. It's truly baffling, that people are allowed to govern this country when they've never even perceived the truth. You know what I mean? So today we're going to dig into a lot of that. There was this guy, Ari Brower, did a lecture with the Religion for Breakfast guy talking about these pivotal brain states, he calls them, and how he believes, that this is the key to revelation and understanding, however you want to think of it, whether that's, higher planes of consciousness or reality. But my thinking here is largely from the school of thought that says that, the brain is like a radar dish. It's designed to pick up certain frequencies. I know people toss that language around a lot, but what I really mean by that is that perception, stimuli, light, sound, the ways that we perceive the world. Our brains are filters, that take the stimuli and use it to construct a theory of reality. I think theory is the right word. The word theory comes from seeing in the Greek. In other words, you have a conception of the world that you're evolved, you're acclimatized to perceive, you're used to, you're used to wanting to know how much traffic there is on the way home, so your ears are kind of attuned to the sounds of traffic so that you are able to understand that information about the world from certain stimuli. That's kind of a one little example of what I mean by this. Another one might be, what the sound of your cat, trying to get your attention because she's hungry, is. So you're especially attuned to that. What I mean to say is that when people say that you only use 10% of your brain, that's actually a misnomer. That's a misunderstanding. I think the misunderstanding comes from this idea of perception, which is true, and that's essentially to say that your brain only uses 10% of the information that it gathers. It's not about areas in your brain that aren't being used. It's about your brain basically filtering out most of what you experience. And the thought goes that when you take these serotonergic drugs, these ergot alkaloids or other alkaloid type drugs, which is biochemically what most psychedelics kind of fall into, these are drugs that mimic serotonin in the brain. They'll cause your serotonin receptors either to overfire in the case of DMT, or to fire continuously over the span of several hours, which is what LSD does. And basically, when your perceptive parts of your brain, when the parts of your brain that govern sight, sound, and social stimuli, and kind of just higher cognition in general, when these parts start to have these continuously firing serotonin events, what we see is that they no longer do their typical job of filtering your sense perception into a preconceived notion of the world. Preconceived is probably not the right word. I hope you can understand the picture that I'm communicating here, because I have very little in the way of the studies, the evidence right in front of me. You're going to have to take me on faith that I'm paraphrasing, quoting, remembering this information somewhat correctly. And if everybody feel free to Google, find sources, plug them in, you'll see what I'm talking about. Again, the idea goes, your brain understands the world in a certain way. I'm sitting in my office. My office has Christmas lights. I know what Christmas lights are. I know where the coffee machine is. I know what this food in front of me is and the clothes I'm wearing. I have an understanding of these things, and my perception of them, the raw perception of the light hitting the coffee maker, the light hitting the clothes and whatnot, fits into the picture of the world that my brain has constructed, and so everything continues all hunky-dory. The idea is that when you have continuously firing serotonin in your visual centers, in your audio centers, you're no longer using those familiar pathways. Your brain is usually filtering information down certain neural pathways that it's become familiar with. When the serotonin thing happens, they find new pathways, and the thinking goes that you actually perceive essentially 100% of the truth around you, the true stimuli, light, sound, etc. around you when you're doing these drugs. And also, as they're finding new pathways to where they're going in your higher perception parts of your brain, they're essentially crossing paths and creating a synesthetic effect that is quite enjoyable. And that synesthetic effect isn't just enjoyable in the sense that it's fun to, taste colors and whatnot. I mean, I think at the end of the day, there's useful experiences in that. Even if you can't literally taste colors, even if you couldn't, dye a soda blue instead of red and be able to taste the difference if you were blindfolded. That's not what it really means to taste colors. Having these associations, excuse me, I think is useful, even if it's just sort of a, for lack of a better word, colorful and kind of inaccurate way of describing how the brain is storing information. I think it's useful. And I tend to think that, we as a Western society are extremely anti-hedonistic at core. I mean, we've become extremely hedonistic in the course of the last maybe 70 years, in the time since 1967, let's say. But what I mean is that we have this deep awareness, that we should constantly be sigma grind maxing. We should constantly be torturing ourselves in order to have a better life. The worst thing you can be is lazy or indulgent, you know what I mean? I think to a certain extent this is sort of the baseline consciousness of the West that's a legacy of, Christian moral teachings in the Catholic Church and whatnot. Not that I have anything against any particular religious organization. That's not at all what I mean. Wes Cecil does a great job of talking about this. I mean, he would blame it actually on Calvinism, theologically speaking. We can tackle that another time. I love talking theology on this channel. In fact, that's kind of the focus of this here talk today, has to do with like the belief in metaphysical realities as such, since it seems to be it seems to be a replicable fact that people take these psychedelic drugs and break down the barriers against perception and become convinced of certain metaphysical truths. They're not always very well formed, and they usually seem to be influenced by the culture that they're around, so that a person in India might have a Hindu experience and a person in Jerusalem might have like a messianic experience, right? But the replicable phenomenon of people that, identify as atheist or secular or scientific or agnostic, no longer seeing the world the same after using psychedelic drugs. And if you are someone in the comments, if you are an atheist who's used acid or DMT and remain an atheist, I'm interested in your story too. But this is sort of the subject matter that we're looking to dig into here. Highly recommend Ari Brower's work on this subject. It's a subject that's very near and dear to myself personally. But so sort of what I'm getting at is, if you imagine tripping balls in the woods and closing your eyes and seeing like the Virgin Mary or the Tooth Fairy or something. Those are, by the way, I've had both of those hallucinations on separate occasions. In some sense, what you're perceiving is what is real. I don't mean that in the sense like, oh, like I saw something and it was like physically there. It's more like the hallucination of a certain type could be seen as a kind of daydreaming, a kind of thinking out loud. But it's always influenced by sort of visual patterns that you see, the kind of geometry of psychedelia, which is a distinct phenomenon, I think, from hallucination. People that have never done these drugs probably need like a visual stimulus to kind of understand what I'm talking about. But there's sort of two types of hallucinations, or two types of visual perception distortions that happen when you use, for example, LSD. The first is sort of an overlay over reality. You're still seeing what is there, but it's more colorful. There's tracers, there's different visual artifacts that kind of make it look like post-processed reality. It's really hard to explain to someone who's never been there, because as soon as you try to focus on something, it seems normal. The best way I could explain this, like, it's sort of like you only see these things when you're moving, when you turn your head, when you look somewhere. You could stare at a wall and it would kind of melt into visual hallucinations, but then you kind of blink and look somewhere else and everything's normal for a fraction of a second. And the higher the dose you do, sort of the more overpowering it becomes. But that's sort of the first type of hallucination. And then there's the second type, which is like the, oh my God, there's pink elephants, or my head turned into a tangerine kind of thing. Those types of hallucinations do exist. It's not a joke, it's not a myth, but at the same time, a lot of people would report that when they have those types of experiences, that they don't actually think that it's real, that they're aware that they're hallucinating, but nonetheless they have a perception of this thing that they know isn't real. To me, that sounds a lot like dreaming. That sounds a lot like having a lucid dream. And I would essentially kind of think of it in the same terms. So if you just imagine that the difference between these two types of hallucinations, the abstract and the sort of unreal, I think the only tangible difference between them is that the difference is imagination. In the first one, you're seeing something that's the real world but different, and the second time you're imagining something incredibly vividly. And if you've had the second type of hallucination where it was so real that you actually thought that it was real, I'm also interested to hear your story, because I could say anecdotally that I have kind of had that, except that it wasn't I don't know how to explain this. It wasn't a hallucination. It was a delusion. I was having multiple hallucinations of things that I knew weren't real, but I also was convinced of basically a conspiracy theory that it's the Truman Show is what it is. And I think people that have used these drugs can very much relate to those terms, relate to that movie. It was the Truman Show. It's apparently a very common thing that happens. I think they actually call it Truman Show delusion. Enough about that. We can talk about that some other time. Yeah, so if you think about the difference between the abstract hallucination and the unreal hallucination as being imagination, basically, then what we kind of open the door to is the idea that the abstract hallucination isn't really a hallucination as such. If you reconstruct the way that the eye works, if you imagine, or if you think about how all these light particles, photons, wave particle interactions, if the light is constantly entering the eye and is basically, perceived by the cone cells and the rod cells, and this constructs an image in the mind, there's a lot of information that's getting basically thrown out as junk data. And I think that when you're under the influence of LSD or other kind of drugs, it's that you are actually able to see the junk data, and it gets integrated into your visual world without the filter of your everyday consciousness. This is always talked about by like New Age people in terms of like higher consciousness, higher self, and different kinds of pseudoscientific jargon. But my ultimate idea here is that all of it can be expressed in terms of actual science, of actual psychological reality. And the reason for that isn't because the world is a narrow materialist, reductionist paradigm, but rather because real science comes up with terms that actually describe the world. And psychology is very, apt for this purpose. Anyway, so the idea is that the abstract hallucinations of psychedelia are real, and you're just only able to see them when you're not in your everyday kind of waking brain state, with dreams kind of representing like a third option where you kind of can see the truth when you're dreaming, but you aren't looking at anything. That's kind of the best way I can explain it. And we're going to dig deeper into this topic later. Right now, we're going to...